Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for coming this evening to the first Gresham lecture on the organ, as I understand it. Welcome to St Margaret, Lothbury, the most exciting church in the City of London, and as you've heard, the most magnificent organ in the City of London. This organ was built in 1800 by George Pike, England, one of the great 18th century organ builders of this country. It was opened on Easter Day, 1801, and thus it's an 18th century organ. And the real link is the fact that in 1837, a man called Felix Mendelssohn Bartholdy came here and played this organ. The second lecture at St Margaret Hill is the other organ in the city which he played, perhaps on the same day. And so there's a link between these two lectures through Mendelssohn and through the organ. So it's my remit this evening to lead you from nowhere up to Mendelssohn, and I'm not allowed to go past it, because otherwise in 2 weeks' time, what's Robert Quinney going to speak about? So that's how it's going to be. And I've assumed that none of you know nothing about the organ. And looking around, I can't see any organists, so perhaps I'm on firm ground. So I'm going to assume that you know nothing. And therefore, I want to begin a little bit with explaining what an organ is, because in a sense, an organ doesn't exist. Every organ is unique. Every organ is made for the building it's in. And one of the reasons why this organ here sounds so magnificent is the building. This building, like the Musikverein in Vienna, has a shoebox shape and a flat roof. And as you look up, you think to yourself, what a roof! But it's not actually a roof at all. It's completely and utterly fake. It's actually canvas with plaster on it. And it's supported by the roof above. It's hanging just like a modern office block building does. It's hanging from the real roof. And this is the secret of the sound of this church, because when the organ plays, the roof vibrates like the top of a timpani, like the top of a drum. And that adds, as it were, an extra dimension to the sound. The other thing is that this church is full of wood. And because it's full of wood, all the wood in here resonates with the organ, because music is, in fact, vibration. And when an organ works, it actually makes vibrations. And the vibrations vibrate everything. The window glass, the lower pipes will make the windows rattle a tiny little bit. The wood, everything makes the sound. So the sound of this organ is the building. And that's why every organ is a work of art, because every organ is made and finished by one organ builder. And it's the ear of that organ builder, who's now lived 200 and something years, that you're hearing this evening. The organ goes back in time to ancient China. If you go to the Museum of the Royal College of Music in South Kensington, you can actually see some things called shengs, which are the original organs. They're bowls out of which come reed pipes, and you play them by blowing in and putting your fingers around them. That's not a real church organ. If you go to ancient Rome, you go to ancient Greece, you'll find things called hydraulis, and they're organs. The first organ which we have a record of in England was in Winchester Cathedral, and apparently it was a fearsome sound, a dreadful din, because everything worked at once. But the real organs that you want to know about are the organs which began in medieval times. One morning, some monk, totally anonymous, must have woken up with this brand new idea. Do you know that the main trouble with church choirs is that they don't sing in tune? Church choirs are unique for singing out of tune, and they need help. And it must have been that he had a nightmare that night, and he thought to himself, you know, the monks in the morning, their singing is dreadful. The first service, of course, was very early in the morning and very cold in the winter. So in the winter they sang sharp, and in the summer when it was nice and warm they sang flat. And he thought to himself, there must be something we could do to help these singers. And somehow he suddenly thought, well, why don't we take a box of wood and fill it with wind under pressure, get somebody to pump it, and put some pipes on top. And then I could play the tune, and they could sing in tune. And that's how the organ began. A big box of wind and pipes, like you see there, just standing on top of them. And if Martin Ball is kind enough to play a little bit on the face pipes, which you can see there, which are exactly as they were in 1800, we haven't touched them, you'll hear what that medieval monk thought of in the middle of the night. If you'd been here on Easter Day 1801, that's the sound you'd have heard. It's been untouched since then. So buying an organ is a very good way of using your money. All organists are the same. It was Dean Ing, who was dean of the big church up the road, St Paul's Cathedral. He used to say, you organists are like cab horses. You always want another stop. And so he must have thought to himself, yes, one rank of pipes, very nice. Now suppose I put another lot of pipes in half as long. So here's just one of those big 8-foot pipes, first of all, just a single note. Now if you cut the pipe in half, it goes up an octave. Jolly good idea, he thought to himself. How about if I cut that in half and it goes up another octave? Organists are very clever, you see. One finger, 3 notes. It's like Tesco's, you see. And then he had a sudden thought. Now, perhaps instead of going half, I halved the half. And that way you'll get something even more interesting. This is playing with people's ears, really, because this is now using harmonics. When you have a sound, any single sound, you don't have a single sound. A single sound is made up of a whole lot of harmonics. The octave, the next octave, the next octave, it goes all the way up until eventually you get a very flattened seventh at the very top. Now, if you're an organ builder, you suddenly think to yourself, I can cheat people's ears with this. So some bright spark thought to himself, how would it be if instead of having one pipe for every note, I had 3 pipes for every note? And we'll call it a mixture. So 3 pipes for every note. One finger is now playing 7 pipes. But you don't hear them as 7 pipes, you hear them as one sound. And that's the trick of the organ. The organ is made up of acoustical tricks the entire time. And then, of course, the organist thought to himself, well, you know, I'm just playing the plain song to help out the singers and keep them in tune, and that's all I'm doing. I think I'd like to be doing something on my own. I think I'd like to decorate the tune a little tiny bit. Organists are terrible people like this. And so the organist suddenly became somebody who freaked out in a way. Now, all he was doing at this time was playing the Mass, because, of course, everybody in those days were Roman Catholics. And so he was thinking to himself, you know, they're singing this tune, they've only got 7 made. Oh, dear, we must make it more interesting. How could we do that? If I play something with them, that rather negates it because they're all going to go wrong. So how would it be, this is an organist thinking, of course, how would it be if I got the choir to stop and I played on my own? That's a very good idea. And then how do you do that in a service without the priest telling you off? Because at that time there wasn't any organ music as such. And so they suddenly thought to themselves, well, we could do it alternately. We could actually have the choir sing the first Kyrie, and then I, the organist, will play the second Kyrie on my own, and then they can sing the third Kyrie. And then they can sing the first Christe, and I'll play the second one, and the organist has suddenly got half the music for the service in his pocket. Wonderful. So here goes. This is the earliest piece of organ music which we still have, which we really can say is there. So here's the monk singing, Kyrie, and here's the organist. Etc. Do you see how it's going? So this is how organ music really began. It was the organist freaking out. And this actually started a tradition which is going to go on and on and on and on and on. In fact, it never stops. So it's the beginning of time, and this comes from a thing called Codex Fiana. This is the earliest piece of keyboard music we had, before the Robertsbridge Codex even. And, oh well, of course, about 10 years later, the organist suddenly thought to himself, it's all very well, you know, playing with your fingers. What about playing with my feet? That would be nice. About 1325, we have the record of the first time there were organ pedals. It's a very curious thing that it was about 1825 when people in England got organ pedals. We're very backward compared with other people. However as it be, this tradition goes on. So you've got this tradition of doing alternatim. And this goes all the way through the Catholic Church and the liturgy at that time. And if we can then jump for a couple of 100 years, we can jump to St Peter's at Rome, which is opposite today, because, of course, His Holiness the Pope is here with us today. Well, not here, but in the country. And he had a very, very famous, or his predecessor had a very, very famous organist called Girolamo Frescobaldi. Girolamo Frescobaldi was one of the first real organ composers, and one of the first real organ teachers too. And he attracted people from the whole of the southern part of Europe to come to study with him in Rome. At the same time, there's a man called Svelink up in Amsterdam, a Protestant, and he attracted people from the north, and you suddenly get this division of the character of music and the way in which it was taught. We'll come back to that in a minute. Frescobaldi did exactly the same thing as that 13th century composer. He wrote a whole series of masses for the organ, and they were to be sung alternatim. He even wrote one wonderful piece, Sancta Maria Mater, which actually the organist has to sing at the same time as he's playing. That's a bit difficult for us tonight. So here's a bit from Fiori Musicali, And this is the elevation toccata. And this gives you a different sort of idea of how music had, in a sense, moved on. That first piece you heard, the organist is experimenting with diminution. You've got the Kyrie, the left-hand part, in very long notes, and over the top you've notes which are 16 or even 32 times faster going around, and the rhythms jig about a bit because it was jiggy music. And now you come to Frescobaldi, and this is a real sort of idea of how the organ can actually work in a big building. You have to imagine now that you're in St Peter's, Rome, a very big building. If you're in a very big building, harmony has to move very slowly, otherwise it becomes a muddle. That's really the secret of writing for a big building. Sometimes you can write a piece for a building and it doesn't work anywhere else. You can hear some pieces, for example, written for St Paul's Cathedral, which there sound magnificent. And you take them to a small parish church and they sound very, very odd. And it's because the building has changed. Because a good composer composes for the building. And that's what Frescobaldi did. He had a huge building, and he knew that in a huge building, if you move the harmonies very slowly, you'll make a wonderful sound system, as it were. And the point of the elevation toccata was that it had to be a very calm moment. You must imagine now that you are Italian, you are living there in the 16th century, you don't wash very frequently, there are no chairs to sit down in the church, everybody has to stand. The services are very long, there's no heating, and so, of course, like all Italians, you'll start talking. And as soon as you start talking, the noise goes up and up and up and up and up. So you need something in the elevation to calm the people down. And this, from Fiori Musicali, 1635, is Frescobaldi's intention of calming you all down. Isn't it wonderful music? You can hear how slowly the harmonies move, and you can imagine in a huge church how that floats through the air. and makes its effect. And those who are very clever will have realised that the tune which is behind all that is exactly the same tune as you heard in the first piece, because everything in those days was founded on the plain song. And so you can imagine that in this wonderful atmosphere of all these pieces, these were all improvised. And Frescobaldi wrote in the preface of Fiori Musicali that every piece should sound as if it was freely composed by the person playing it. These, in a sense, were just ideas he was throwing out. And you can probably guess who it was who actually wrote out Fiori Musicali, who it was who actually had a copy. Johann Sebastian Bach. And that tells you something about how important Frescobaldi is in the essence of how organ music has developed. But the whole idea of this improvisatory notion was, of course, the fact that in those days, organists always played for themselves, and most music was improvised, because all this music had to fit what was going on at the other end of the church by the altar. The whole thing was like film music, really. It had to fit what was happening as the action of the Mass. Take yourself back to being in the congregation in those days. The phrase, the weakest go to the wall, comes from those days. No churches had seats. Services were long. People had to stand. It was used in many different ways, the church at that time. One of the features of the organ was, in a sense, to point to what was happening at the altar, which could be a very, very long way away. Imagine yourself in the back row of St. Peter's and not knowing what was going on in the front. You would be able to tell from the organ music, because the organ music fulfilled that purpose. It wasn't organ music for concerts they were writing. Frescobaldi did give concerts. On one occasion he had the biggest audience anybody's ever had. It's said that over 30,000 people went to one of his recitals. They can't be good at counting, can they really? But it's possible it was a huge crowd. But the music wasn't written to be anything other than the accompaniment to the liturgy. And that's true of everything which we're going to hear this evening. All organ music stems from the liturgy. It's very, very recent that organ music has become concert music and devoid of the liturgy. And it was the requirement of the liturgy which made the music sound the way it did. But let's go back to that mythical organist with his organ. So far you've heard pipes, all of which look like the ones you can see. And even the ones you've just heard, the wonderful voce umana, as it's called in Italy, this wonderful warm sound you heard in the Frescobaldi, it's open pipes. And when you have your pipe, there are very few things you can do with your pipe. You can change the scale, you can change the diameter, and by doing that you can make it either softer or louder, more reedy, have a little bit more of this, that or the other. You can actually make it have different harmonics sound out, or you can squash it in at the top so it's not straight up. If you squash it in you get another sort of sound, or you can squash it out if you want to too. You can do all sorts of things like that, but there is a limit to how it'll go. So he must have had an idea one day and he thought to himself, there must be another way of doing it. You know, all these metal pipes, fantastic, but there must be another way. And perhaps he thought, you know, what about making the pipes of wood? If we make the pipes of wood, they should sound different. So here's an open wooden flute. See what I mean by the acoustic of the church? Sounds really good. And if I just make a little change here, yeah, I've got another idea in that case. Why don't I actually stop it altogether? So I'll stop it altogether. And that makes it easier to tune it, because just by moving that, oh, there's the choir singing out of tune again. Push it back a bit. Make them work for their money this weekend. Ho, ho, ho. Wait for the tenors. Pretty good. So, wooden pipes. Then you've got a change. You've got metal pipes and you've got wooden pipes. Really good. All pipes work in the same way. They've got feet. And because the pipes must stand in a rack, otherwise they'd all fall over, they're standing on top of the air. Now, if you've only got air, they're all going to speak together. So they had to invent something which was really from the key to put a little wire to a pallet underneath here. And what happens is you've got your pipes standing there and the pallet opens. And as it opens, you can make the sound. And this is why, look, all organs should be like this one here, mechanical, because you can then, by the way you touch the key, you can adjust the way in which the air goes into the pipe. If the air goes in fast and full, you get one sort of sound from the same pipe. You can change that sound by making it go slow, and by touching it, you can actually make it sound quite different. Just like a flute player does with their tongue. Your tongue is your finger and the palate. Well, that's all very well and good, but that means that all the pipes have got to sit on the same long palate, and they're all going to speak together. Now, that's not very clever. Have you ever been to New York? If you've been to New York, they've got a wonderful system in New York. They designed New York, well, an organ builder actually designed New York, because they go that way and that way, the streets, don't they? Designed by an organ builder. Because, you see, you've got your palates going that way. Now, if you only want the pipes to speak in turn, if you had something going that way, it would stop them. And that's why we have organ stops. The organ stops which you pull out actually control which pipes get the wind. The palate opens for the whole lot, but they're blocked off by the stop slide going the other way. And that was invented 700 years ago, so we haven't come very far. And that's the way it works, really. Oh, that organist, he wants more pipes and stops and things, and he's not happy at all. Well, organists are never happy, really. He's got metal pipes, different diameters, different sounds. He's got wooden pipes, different diameters, different sounds. He's got open ones, he's got stopped ones. So he's got to think of something else to entertain himself, especially on the long winter nights when the sermons are long. So let's have a combination. Perhaps we'll have one of these. Now, this is just a funny metal pipe. Somebody thought this up in their bath, I expect. It's got its foot, that's all right. And then it's got a funny thing on the top here. And it's got a sort of spring sticking out here. It looks like an Emmet thing, really, doesn't it? You know, this could have come out of a sort of Punch cartoon or something or other. So whatever will happen if we put wind into this thing? Well, he thought that up on a train, obviously. So here's our next family. This is the reeds. And the secret lies inside here. You just wish you'd invented this and patented it. You'd be making money. That's the foot. Has no purpose, has no feet. Oh, feet have no purpose of just putting the air into the thing. But this is the clever bit. In here, there's a little tiny reed, we call it, but it's actually a little spring. And it's a very, very thin bit of metal, and it goes against another bit of metal, the shallot, and this has got a little space in it behind here, and this thing tunes it. And because that vibrates there, it makes the air in here vibrate, and it pops along here and gets up the top, and that's why it makes it sound. And that's what we call a reed. So we've got trumpets coming into the organ now, and cremornes, and voce-humanas, and oboes, and in the next lecture, but not this one, clarinets, and in this one, cremonas, and in the next lecture, but not this one, tubas. Decadence. Terrible. You can all have a go afterwards. It's made of leads, you'll get poisoned. Never mind. It's very good for getting taxis, this. So that's the beginning of something new. So now we must use that. And to do that, we must move now to France, because the French have a different way of looking at an organ. The French love colours. You know, when you hear that Frescobaldi, you can smell the incense in that music. When you hear French music, you can smell Chanel 5 and croissant and camembert and that wonderful coffee. Their music makes you think, what is it that makes France great? Well, it's obviously the women. And it's the way they look and the decoration. Because French women are all decoration, aren't they? Think of all those wonderful clothes and hats and scarves and handbags and everything. And French music is all decoration. This is the one big difference. The music of Frescobaldi has an attraction because of the way the harmonies evolve. That must be what attracted Bach to that music. It must have been that way because Bach evolved from that. But Bach also had copies of French music. He was very, very taken with French music. And French music is all decoration. It's very simple harmonies, simple melodies, which are decorated to such a degree that they become absolutely ravishing. And the French organists loved colour, so their organs were huge, magnificent, but they were full of colourful stops. They were full of these things, Cremornes. They were full of trumpets en chamade, all these sort of things. And they also had enormous trickery in them for your ear. They loved things like the nasade and the tierce and the larigot and the cornet. And these are things where you take the harmonics and you use the harmonics to trick people's ears. You can do it again and again and again. And they used to do it in the course of the Mass. The great thing about French churches is that they have traditions of organists. The great church of Saint-Gervais in Paris had the same family as organists for 250 years, the family of Couperin. And of all the Couperins, the greatest was François Couperin, who was called François Couperin le Grand. He was the organist in the 1660s of Saint-Gervais. It must have been a wonderful experience to go on a Sunday and hear this man play, because, of course, every time it was improvised music, as it is this very day. If you go to any of the big churches in Paris now, go to Saint-Eustache, go to Saint-Sulpice, go to Notre Dame, the organist doesn't take any music with him because the organist improvises. And in every one of these churches you'll find somebody who is a world-renowned organist playing for Sunday. And they improvise. And these improvisations make the place come alive. And that's what Couperin did. But luckily, as a young man, he actually wrote down 2 of the organ masses, and they were published. And so here, to give you a sense of the organ in France, is the movement for the Benedictus. The Benedictus, of course, has to be a calm movement. It has to be, in a sense, a very decorated movement. And he wrote it as a tierce, as he wrote as a Cremorne on tie. On tie means it's in the tenor register. So you have on the fond d'orgue, which is the 8 foots of the organ, the right hand in 2 parts. And because he was French and therefore very clever, he could play with his feet as well. So he has the bass on an 8 foot with his feet, and in between these 2 comes the tune. And it comes on this wonderful thing, which is the French Cremorne, which is a thing like that. It's a very short resonator reed, but it has a wonderful, wonderful, rich sound. And you hear how in this piece the harmonies move so slowly, but it's different to Frescobaldi because the tune becomes so important. And it's the decoration which you'll hear in the tune. It's exactly the same mass as you've heard already. That medieval one was exactly the same. Ti-da-da-da-dum is all you've got in this one here. But listen to what he does to it. Can't you smell the difference? It evokes a completely different style, but it's a wonderful, wonderful picture. There's wonderful tunes coming in. And if you go to Paris this very day, you'll hear organists doing exactly the same thing. And the astonishing thing you see through all this is the fact that you haven't done anything as the congregation. You've been to the service, you participate in the service, but you haven't done anything. You haven't sung a single note. The organist has played, and the singing of the Gregorian has been done by the priests or by the scholar. But the congregation do nothing. That's what Luther didn't like. And this is the big, big difference. And this is why I've called this Catholics versus Protestants. 1517. 1517 was when Luther put up his articles on the church door. And Luther had this extraordinary idea that the congregation should be involved by singing in the service. Absolutely novel idea. Sometimes I wish he hadn't thought of that. And they had nothing to sing except the plain song, and he didn't want them to sing plain song. So this extraordinary man actually went around and pinched pop songs. When you come at Passiontide and you sing the wonderful Passion Chorale, you're actually singing a very rude song which was sung at the Battle of Pavia by the soldiers. The text is dreadfully rude, and everybody who heard the tune knew it was rude. And so Luther wrote, "O Sacred Head Surrounded," and put a text which wasn't to those tunes. And all the tunes which he took were tunes which were popular tunes of the day. And he took that because he wanted the people who whistled them in the street to be able to sing them in church. And this was a novelty, extraordinary. The Catholics, not at all. But the Protestants, yes. Because now the service will change, because it's not going to be so structured in the liturgy of the Mass. It's going to be much more structured on the reading of the Bible. It's going to be much more structured on the sermon, which is going to be the principal part of the undertaking for the Sunday. And in between, the people are going to sing. And they're going to sing tunes they know. And remember at this point that none of you would be able to read, because you're all poor people. And the only people who could read in those days were the clergy, the educated people, or perhaps some very rich people, some scholars. But most people couldn't read. They had to learn everything by heart. And Luther wanted to have long hymns, 4, 5, 6 verses, a lot for people to learn. So what actually happened was he produced hymn books which would go for the seasons of the church's year. And so for the season of the year, in that season, at every service, you'd sing the same hymn. So, for example, if you'd come here on the first Sunday in Advent, you'd have sung Nun kommt den Heiden Heiland, now comes the Saviour of our race. And that would have been the first hymn for all 4 Sundays of Advent. And you had to sing that hymn. Because you learnt it by heart, you could all sing it. And everybody sang in harmony, in unison. The harmony was provided by the organ. But then you've got this organist again who's bored at just sort of accompanying people who are singing. And so the organists are saying to themselves, no, not having that, Mr. Luther. No, not just going to stay and play tunes for the congregation to sing. No, I want to do something special about it. And he had this great idea, Luther, that music was so important in the service. And therefore music should actually be listened to, not heard. You know, very often these days, come to a wedding here, and the organist is playing before, and everybody talks as loud as they can to sort of drown him out. Luther had this great idea, which they still have in those Protestant churches, that the organ should be listened to. So before the service, there was no music. The great thing was an organ prelude for the service to begin. And the priest would come in and sit down and listen to the organ. And when the organ finished, then he'd stand up and begin the service. There was another point to this, of course. The piece had to be loud, because all the people coming into the church, in those days churches were always full, all the people coming into the churches would start talking to each other. The church was a meeting place. And so they'd be talking and walking around. And therefore it was essential that the organ played so that people knew something was going to happen. And then they should keep quiet. The piece which you heard at the beginning today was designed in the same way. I hope you were all talking. And then you stopped. Because that was Bach. That was the Fantasia in G major of Johann Sebastian Bach. And its intention was that it would be at the beginning of the service, the preludium. They weren't called preludes and fugues, they were called preludiums. And that preludium actually stopped people in their tracks saying, we're beginning. If you go to Switzerland this very day, the same thing happens. The service hasn't changed. It's exactly the same. Loud piece, in comes the clergyman, sits down under the pulpit, listens to the music, and then it begins. So it's like an overture, and it's therefore got to be an overture which fits the season of the church's year. And then the chorale. So the organist thinking to himself, not just play over the tune, because after all they all know the tune. If you come on Advent 1, you know you're going to sing Nunc Come de Heiden Heiland. So no, won't play over the tune. Better idea would be to make an interesting piece out of it. And thus developed the Chorale Prelude. And the finest chorale preludes are by Buxtehude and by Bach. There's no argument about that. But these chorale preludes had a very different purpose to just playing over the tune. If you come now to an Anglican church, you often hear the organist play the tune and the harmonies which you're about to sing. And you always think, it's just one extra verse on the hymn. Why never did he do that? Because it's to set the tempo, it's to set the pitch, it's to make people know what the tune is, and then hopefully they'll sing it. Now, if you go back to Bach, you see, they didn't need to do that, because you knew what you were going to sing before you came in. You knew the words of Nunc Come de Heiden Heiland, you knew the tune of Nunc Come de Heiden Heiland, so you wanted something else. And the important thing, going back to Luther, was the words. The words were the important thing, and what the words meant was even more important. And what all these chorale preludes have to do, and what Bach did better than anybody else, was to make preludes which actually interpret the meaning of the text. And that's why some of his pieces are so difficult to play, because there's so much in them. The whole idea was that when you heard these chorale preludes, you were thinking about the words of the chorale, not just the tune. And therefore, the chorale prelude has to be, as it were, a picture postcard of whatever that chorale is about. And then that chorale, which often was very simple tunes, has to be ornamented. So here's a very, very simple tune. Di da 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 dum. Wer nur den lieben Gott lässt walten. And this is what Bach makes it come into, this wonderful prelude. And it's a picture of the words of this piece. And the people sitting or standing in the church would have thought to themselves the words of the first verse as they heard this. And then they could sing it afterwards with meaning. They got the pitch, they got the speed, they got the meaning. And that's what a chorale prelude is really all about. Thou but suffer God to guide thee, he'll give thee strength, whatever are the words of this. And you have this sensation of this piece telling you, as it were, an interpretation of the text. And that's the important difference. You can hear now something completely different to the music you heard before. In a sense, this music is not there to entertain you, it's there to instruct you. That's one of the big differences. Italian music, French music, in a sense, is music to entertain you, to tickle your ear a little tiny bit. And German music, Protestant music, music in the Lutheran tradition, in the Calvinistic tradition too, music there is to educate you. In a sense, it's part and parcel, as Luther said it had to be. It's part and parcel of the experience of going to the service on a Sunday, to the Gottesdienst. The idea was that the reading from the Bible should be the inspiration for the chorales which were sung, and should be the inspiration for the sermon which was preached. And so the cantatas, which eventually, of course, come in the bigger churches from Bach, these are the cantatas for the particular Sundays too, and the cantatas have the chorales within them for the people to sing. And the same, of course, for the Holy Week, for the Passions. The intention of the Passions was that the structure of the Passion should be the chorales, and that all the congregation should sing the chorales. So I hope the next time you're sitting in the festival hall, when it comes to the chorale, you all stand up and join in. Because then it would be an authentic performance. The number of times you have been to an authentic performance which wasn't authentic because you didn't take part, so you should shout out at the end. If this is an authentic performance with authentic instruments and all the fingering and this, that and the other, I should be singing out of tune the chorales at the same time. And then it becomes an authentic performance. Authentic performances are only authentic if they actually take all part of it. It was never intended in the St Matthew Passion, for example, that the people should sit silent and respectful for 3 hours listening to the music performed by somebody else. The idea of the piece was that you were part of it. We had a wonderful reincarnation of this in one of my other churches when Jonathan Miller actually did a dramatic recreation of the St John Passion in our church, and everybody had to take part in it. And it was a revelation as to how an authentic piece of Bach should actually work. These were inclusive pieces, and that's another big difference. In the Catholic music, it was exclusive. The people who did the music were the musicians. The idea of Luther was that in the Protestant church, it should be inclusive, thus everybody, regardless of their talent, would be part of the undertaking. So on the Sunday, you'd be singing your chorales, full-throated, and Bach would be introducing them to you. Here's a very different one, because this one, Es ist das Heil, is a joyous and wonderful piece, and therefore the music has to be joyous, because it suddenly has to set in your mind the fact that this one is one which you're going to sing with joy in your heart, and you can almost tell what the words are going to be by the rushing of the semiquavers. Always in Bach, there are pictures in the music. The great thing about Bach is that he had the technique which other people didn't have. He had the technique to actually make things musically happen that actually all worked the whole way through. It's quite easy when you're writing a piece of music to start a piece. It gets difficult after the 16th bar. It gets very difficult after the 32nd bar. And after the 64th bar, it's really tough going. And now you think that some of the pieces that Bach wrote actually last for 12 or 15 minutes. And you think of all the other music written at that time and before him, and all the other music is short sections stuck together like Lego blocks. Bach was the first person to write long music. I had a great friend who once said Bach was the first person to write boring music. And what he meant was it went on so long you actually had to pay attention. Do you know the attention span of people nowadays is 3 minutes? I'm sorry I've spoken for longer. On the Today programme, there's a rule that only the Prime Minister can speak for more than 3 minutes. Then they cut you off. Even before you've started, they say, we're short of time. So 3 minutes it is. You think of pieces by Bach, all those people sitting there, first time hearing pieces of this length. And the reason he can do it is because he knows how to structure music. He knows how to actually make melodies develop. He knows how to make harmonies lead into interesting places. And even this little tiny piece here, only 32 bars, this prelude, even in this piece you can tell the way in which he's using harmony to keep the piece going. In the middle, there are no cadences on which you can stop. The music's always got to keep going forward. And that's something which he discovered. Other people's music very often just stops. but he actually made ways in which music just moves forward again and again. And in this one, as this does Heil, you can hear the joy of this chorale in all the bits underneath. The tune itself is terribly, terribly dull. Lots of repeating notes, dum, 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 oh my goodness me. But he makes it joyous. Now is salvation come to us with words. So you can tell how music has changed and how it's changed between the two religions and how it changed because of the needs of the two religions. And all the music was written for these great services. You've got the Catholics with their mass taking place at the far end of the church. You've got Luther, who purposely put the pulpit in the middle of the nave. It wasn't at the far end. He moved it in the middle of the nave so that it'd be surrounded by the people and how they're included in the music. Now I have to tell you that the person who's been playing all that music for you this evening is not Birger Malmvik. Birger Malmvik was being taken ill on Sundays in hospital in Kalmar, and so I'm more than grateful that at the very last minute my great old friend Martin Ball has played for you this evening. So here's the link to the next lecture. Can you imagine this wonderful music of Bach was thought by the end of his life, 1750, to be old-fashioned, not interesting, dull, boring, we don't want to have anything to do with it. And that was his son speaking. Well, if you've got sons, you may know this scenario. Fashions had changed totally. His music was out of date. And it lay in the library of the Thomas Kirk for the most part, undisturbed. Until the 1820s, a young man, son of a wealthy, rich banker, living in Leipzig, not too much to do, messing around one day in the library, came upon the St Matthew Passion. And because musicians open a book and can hear it when they see it, he was blown away, as they'd say nowadays, by what he could hear in his ears. And he delved further, and he found organ music by Bach, untouched since 1750. 60 years dust on top of it. And he found this wonderful music, and he thought to himself, I must play this. And I can imagine him, this young man, taking this book of a Bach Preludium home, and thinking I must play it, thinking, God, this is difficult. I'd have to practice to play this. This is more difficult than the music we normally play nowadays. Because the great thing about Bach is that it's always difficult to play. You can play a piece of Bach for 50 years and it's still difficult to play. It's not possible to learn a piece of Bach. There's always something in the corner which makes it new every time you play it. There's always something which recreates it. That is the greatness of Bach. You can never actually get to the end of the tunnel. There's always something there. And you can imagine Mendelssohn sitting there, going through this music and thinking, this is wonderful, I must play it, I must play it. And he did. And he went out and he gave the first performance at St Matthew Passion since Bach's day in Leipzig. and he gave performances. And then by good fortune, our Queen Victoria married a foreigner who was a friend of Mendelssohn, and Mendelssohn came over here to teach Prince Albert the organ and also to play the piano, for Queen Victoria was a good singer to sing to. And he brought with him, of course, Bach. And he brought Bach, and he played, you know, the Prelude and Fugue in A minor, da-da-da-da-dum, da-da-da-da-dum-dum, when he went with Wesley to St Paul's Cathedral. And halfway through, the organ blowers gave up. They had never blown for such a long piece of music before, and they weren't going to. And the vergers shooed everybody out of the church too, because they'd never heard such a long piece. So Mendelssohn brought Bach to England. And that wonderful renaissance of music was then carried on through Samuel Wesley and a man called Sterndale Bennett. And of course it was Samuel Wesley who brought Mendelssohn to play this organ. So it should be that we end today with a piece of Mendelssohn. Maybe he played it on this organ using these stops. And if when you come in 2 weeks' time for the next lecture, please remember that you heard Mendelssohn first here.